Welcome to GCP-Mindset channel. Today we will talk about audits and inspection readiness in clinical investigations. More after the intro.
So let's start with the differences and some specifics between the audits and regulatory authority inspections. So first of all, the readiness is different to the preparation. And why it is different? Because readiness means that you, for example, as a sponsor of a clinical trial, should be able to host the audit or inspection anytime, which means that you need to have the processes available and in place to design, to plan, and to start and conduct the clinical investigation. Of course, fully in line with regulatory requirements, the clinical investigation plan, as well as other requirements available, and also to have adequate resources and equipment. And this should be, the preparation phase should be always available on daily basis, which means that afterwards, when the audit or inspection is announced, the preparation phase starts. Which means that in case you have the readiness status effectively in place, the preparation phase could be much more faster and effective compared to the other scenario in case your readiness is not in a good shape. So especially this could be seen in case the inspection is announced in a very short timeline. For example, if you will host a triggered regulatory authority inspection, the inspection could be announced in 1 or 2, maximum 3 days in advance, which you will probably agree with me that it's a very short time to, let's say, start to be fully prepared for the inspection and to conclude it with a full success. In case the readiness will not be in proper way, then the preparation phase will be very much intense and stressful for all involved. Let's briefly recap the definitions. The audit definition is stated in the ISO 14155, the last version from 2020, which is the good clinical practice in clinical investigations. And the highlight is that this systematic examination of activities and all documents which are related to the clinical investigations should be performed by the independent personnel. So, and this independent personnel means that they are independent on the clinical operation, which means that they are independent on the execution of the projects of the clinical investigations. And of course, all these reviews have to be done, analyzed, reported, and recorded according to clinical investigation plan, standard operating procedures of the sponsor or delegated parties, as well as applicable regulatory requirements. The inspection is not defined exactly in the ISO 14155. However, in general, these are the activities of the control authority, which includes, of course, the review of documents, all associated facilities and records and additional resources, which the authority considered related to the clinical investigation. So the purpose of the audits are to, as a routine part of sponsor's quality assurance. The sponsor should have some quality plan in terms of audits. And nowadays, it's quite common to have a risk-based audit plan or a risk-based audit program available and to ensure the quality in addition to standard quality control procedures. The purpose of the audit is also to assess the effectiveness of monitoring activities in the study, and also to verify if there were any serious or repeating clinical investigation plan deviations, especially if some of them were not reported, then should be thoroughly investigated. The audits may be also planned or conducted in case there is a suspicion of fraud or fraudulent activity, or there are many misconducts identified and reported from the conduct of the clinical investigation. And of course, the audits are usually also performed when the inspection is announced. to ensure that the site, for example, or the sponsor premises or the vendor premises are inspection ready. And there is no need to hide these activities in terms of verification prior to the inspection, because it's also clearly stated in the ISO 14155 that it could be one of the purpose of the audit to prepare the auditee or inspectee for the inspection. There could be also another purpose for the audit performance, which is when it is requested or suggested by regulatory authority. Actually, we also experienced such kind of requests quite recently, because one of our clients, after the study was closed, I think approximately 3 years, and bring the study data to FDA for approval and registration. FDA requested some additional verifications and checks in the study if the blinding was kept properly years ago, and therefore the series of audits were requested to confirm these data. Inspections, the purpose of the inspections is, of course, the supervision of the conduct of the clinical investigation, and also to verify how the sponsors assure the validity of data which are submitted to the authorities or investigators. And also if the adherence to the sponsors' SOPs or the CRO's SOPs and GCP standards by the monitors was adhered and applicable. The timing of the audits, where to conduct the audits, usually anytime. You can do it anytime, since the preparation of the design, for example, the design of clinical investigation plan could be audited until the final report is drafted. So, and mostly often the audits are conducted during the clinical investigation, usually after the startup period, which means during the active phase of the study when the subject enrollment is ongoing. The inspections are mostly often conducted during the clinical investigation. Only in case the data which are reported to regulators, like serious adverse events or device deficiencies reporting during the clinical investigations, which could trigger some safety concerns of the regulatory authority, may trigger such kind of regulatory inspection on site. The audit or inspection objectives are to evaluate the compliance, as I have already mentioned at the beginning. And the main sources for the audit are the investigational plan, procedures of the sponsor or delegated parties, the ISO norm about the GCP, the good clinical practice, and applicable regulatory requirements. In terms of inspection objectives, they are not in scope the written procedures of the sponsor, because the primary focus is the legislative requirements, as well as the clinical investigation plan, which has been anyway approved by regulatory authority. And to achieve these objectives of the audit, the sponsor of a clinical investigation must have available the written SOPs, that's obvious, but the written SOPs not only to conduct the clinical study, clinical investigation, but also how to audit them, as well, including the audit plan and the audit report, how to prepare, how to circulate, how to approve, and to assure the independence. The audit certificate is highlighted in gray because it's not 100% required by the ISO norm. However, it's fully recommended, and is also mentioned in case it's available, should be also filed in a trial master file. In general, there is the overview of the audit process, which could consist of several steps. First, there need to be some plan. Afterwards, the optional step, depending on the processes of the auditor, as well depending on the type of the audit, if it is remote or on site, the vendor questionnaire could be used. Usually, according to the name, it's used for the vendor qualification audits, and especially after the COVID era, we now turned to remote auditing more often than 2 years ago. The next step is, of course, the preparation phase itself. Afterwards, it's the audit conduct, which could last for 1 day until, for example, 5 days. It's also possible depending on the scope of the audit. And afterwards, the audit follow-up, which usually consists of not only writing the audit report, however, also to request the answers to the potential audit observations and findings from the auditee, and to set up the CAPA plan. In terms of inspections, the steps which are visible to inspectee, meaning to the sponsor or the CRO who is working on behalf of the sponsor, is usually that we are receiving the inspection announcement. And for example, our experience from the Czech Republic is, in case there is a running clinical investigation, and the inspector will approach the CRO with the question, how many subjects are already enrolled in the clinical investigation? It's already such kind of announcement that the inspection is planning to take place, which always confirm afterwards. After the announcement, definitely the inspection is conducted and performed, and again, some follow-up is required. And I will speak about it a little bit later on. So the audit scope may cover different topics depending on the type of the audit and the auditee. It should involve all responsible parties and the systems and processes or facilities, and should be always independent from the quality control activities or additional routine monitoring services. And the inspection scope is usually according to the subject of the inspection, because there are also different types of the inspection, like the initial one or the systemic one, usually at the sponsor. It could be also like the control inspection, the follow-up one after the initial one, if there were any critical findings. It could be also targeted, the triggered inspection. Also the inspection to eliminate some deficiencies from the previous inspections, including the international participation from the other authorities, or as a part of joint inspection activity. For example, EMA, together with FDA, initiated such joint inspection activities, which means that for such kind of inspection, which usually lasts 5 days, approximately 5 to 6 inspectors are joining, which I think would be also quite demanding. For the typical scope of the audit and inspection, it's typically included the organization and personnel. Also, how the clinical investigators were selected and how they are monitored. In one of our previous webinar, there were also topics regarding risk-based monitoring and the types of monitoring. So therefore, also the review of rationale and selection of monitoring types is in the scope of the audit or inspection. Also, how the monitors have been selected, because also the ISO norm, as well as also usually the sponsors SOPs define the minimum qualification for the monitors roles. Also, what are the monitoring procedures and activities, and if they are in line with the plan. How it's the process established for the serious adverse event and device deficiency reporting, and if it is adhered to. How are data collected and handled, and also transferred, usually at the end of the study. How are data archived, and how they are retained after the study end. And also the important part is regarding the investigational medical device, accountability and inventory. And any contracts concluded in the trial, means the contracts between the sponsor and the CRO as well. And now we are going to the preparation phase in terms of typical documents which are requested during the preparation phase and prior the audit or inspection is started. So you can see that there are also some, sorry, I'm not at documents, I'm at areas of interest. So first of all, the areas which are in the scope of interest of the auditors and inspectors, typically during the audits and inspections, the black ones are for the clinical side audits or inspections, the typical examples of areas in the interest, and the blue ones are which are in addition for the system audits or inspections, meaning the sponsor side or CRO side. And as you can see, it's a quite large list, and it includes mostly or usually the whole services which are supporting the conduct and planning and designing the clinical investigation. And the real area of interest is always connected to the scope of the audit or the inspection. Now I'm going to the document request. Prior to the audit and the inspection, usually several documents or information are requested either from the auditor or the inspector. Again, the blue highlighted are regarding the system audits or inspections, and the black one are typical for the clinical sites. And this is nothing which is really surprising. And this is also a part when we can focus during the inspection or audit readiness. So if we know that these kind of areas of interest, also the documents which are typically requested, then if these will be ready all the time, there will be no surprises when they are requested ad hoc by the auditor or the inspector. So therefore, just to summarize, what are the audit and the inspections, despite they are running by different, let's say, stakeholders, because audit are under the diction of the sponsor. However, the inspections are run by regulatory authority as the highest control activity in the clinical trials. The aim of the audit or inspection is not to point the finger to someone that he or she failed or she or he made mistakes. The main message is to identify if there were any gaps, to find out if these gaps were only like an individual human error or there is a systematic approach. Of course, if there will be any systematic approach behind a failure identified, it needs immediate improvement. And therefore, all these audits and inspections are always considered from our side at GCPS as a perfect lessons learned. And therefore, we are always happy to host any kind of audit and inspection as an independent feedback to our activities, to our processes, and if we can have some tips for improvements for future. So what the auditors and inspectors focus on? Definitely on the documentation and the compliance with the protocol, as I said already, GCP, SOPs, and legislation. Also, if there are any specific processes regarding the clinical study or clinical investigation. So at least the typical ones are how the oversight in the clinical study is kept, and not only by the sponsor or the CRO, but also by the PI, the principal investigator on site. How is the authorization granted within the study? It means how are the delegation performed and documented. So again, not only the delegation on the clinical side by the principal investigator to the site staff, but also from the sponsor to different parties. How is the informed consent process performed, including the safety reporting, or if there is any specific unblinding procedure during the study, and so on and so on. So it's always good to look into the clinical study design. What are the, let's say, most critical processes involved and most unusual processes involved in a clinical investigation, including those which are very much different to the standard of care, because there you can easily identify a potential risks for the trial conduct and to prevent them proactively. Of course, the important part of the audit and inspection conduct is to verify if the security and rights of the subjects has been adhered, and if the data collected during the study have been collected in certain quality and also transcribed in all the electronic systems used. How the conduct of the audit and inspection looks like generally if in on-site, depending if it is on a sponsor site or at the clinical site. It means that first of all, there should be some introduction part, including the identification. And this is also something which is specific for the inspectors. In case you will host the inspection, it's always good to check out the identification card of the inspector. And anyway, for example, for FDA inspection, it's also expected that the inspectee will do so proactively, which means that you will not disclose a confidential information to someone who will only declare, I am the inspector. You need to verify. Afterwards, the introductory interview is started usually, and including the clarification of the audit scope and duration and so on. In case what we have experienced in triggered a safety inspection, which was announced one working day prior to the start, the introductory interview was mostly skipped and only mentioned that they are there for some verification and they will express their request during the inspection. Usually the facility tour is involved, but could be also skipped depending on the scope of the audit. The majority of the part includes the control of documents and the processes, and including the interviews. So such kind of cross-checks if the documentation is not only self-explaining, but also corresponds with the processes, how they were performed by the key staff. And during the inspections, the question and answer space may not be offered. It depends on the inspector because there could be some various inspection practices in various countries. And the same also apply for the final discussion. Usually during the audits, there are offered question and answer space as well as final discussion on the preliminary findings, because based on the, let's say, last explanation of the auditee, also the findings could be mitigated. However, again, it may not be offered all the time during the inspections.
Thanks for watching and see you in part 2.